and how we relate to them this morning with two rabbis and leaders in our movement. I am Adam Shalom. If you don't know, I'm the Dean for North America of the International Institute and also the Rabbi of Kol Hadash Humanistic Congregation here in suburban Chicago. To my right is Rabbi Jody Kornfeld. She is the Rabbi of Beth Chaverim Humanistic Jewish Community, also in suburban Chicago. She's worked in Jewish education for more than 25 years and holds rabbinic ordination from the IISHJ, a DSJS from Spertus Institute in Chicago, and a law degree from Boston University. Rabbi Miriam Jeris is Rabbi of the Society for Humanistic Judaism and also an associate professor for professional development at the IISHJ. She was also ordained by the Institute and holds a PhD in Jewish Studies from Union Institute and master's degrees from the University of Michigan and from the Michigan School of Professional Psychology. And so without any further ado, I'd like to hand this over to Rabbi Kornfeld to begin our discussion of roots and branches.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. For those of you who know me and or even by reputation, you know that I'm a huge baseball fan. And the role of the leadoff hitter is to basically get on base so that everybody else then can drive the runs in. So it's in that spirit that I lead off this panel. The 12th century Sufi poet Rumi wrote, "Maybe you are searching among the branches for what only appears in the roots." Roots and branches, groundedness and expansiveness. If we only look among the branches for our inspirations and precursors, our search will be inevitably shallow and fail to account for so much of what has preceded us. Branches can be susceptible to the then prevailing winds, and they can break free entirely. Yet, if we examine only the roots, we not only risk missing the enormous and elegant variety derived from them, but what can be mired in what is unseen and immovable. So we operate in the realm of metaphor to see where we came from and who we are, acknowledging that there is no single answer that resonates for each of us. Humanistic Judaism has Jewish culture as a basis for Jewish identity. For me, then, the intellectual ancestors that I look to are found throughout the cultural landscape, specifically those in the arts and letters, in Jewish literature and Jewish art. These are the twin pillars of Jewish culture, and therefore they inform my identity as a humanistic Jew. Whether in writing or the visual arts, their creators have the ability to convey the Jewish experience across time and space, introducing me to Jews who lived in places and eras other than my own. These works have the capacity to educate, to explain, and indeed to entertain. They are populated by the religious and the secular, by the real and the imagined, by the particularistic and the universal. In short, it is the human condition as expressed through a Jewish prism. It has been argued persuasively that Judaism is a religion of memory. The encounter of Judaism with modernity changed not only what was selected to be remembered, but how those memories were expressed. Jewish identity is established through the stories Jews tell about themselves. With increased secularization and decreased religiosity, the role of the author rose while the role of the rabbi or scholar decreased. The space formerly occupied by religious identity and texts was filled with literature as secular identity grew. In so many ways, the Haskalah, or the Jewish Enlightenment, began the significant religious and cultural changes in Judaism that led to the library of Jewish literature. As the 19th century turned to the 20th, rabbinic authority lessened even further, and in its stead, for secular humanistic Jews, writers' narratives came to represent the Jewish experience. In short, our narratives became not only our identities, but the sources of our inspiration and the armature on which to build Jewish memory, ceremony, and ritual. Traditional texts now were activated by allusion. For example, the Tevye stories by Sholem Aleichem, first published in 1894 in Yiddish, question divine justice in the spirit of Job. In 1989, in Mr. Mani, A.B. Yehoshua, writing in Hebrew, presented the Akedah as the central traumatic narrative in Israel, whereby fathers too easily sacrifice their children. Furthermore, in the second half of the 20th century, a new modern literary construct developed that approached and analyzed the biblical text in a literary critical way. Doing so, I think, enabled humanistic Jews to access the text with integrity and without compromise. Literature thus came to be central to modern secular Jewish culture. As a corpus, every genre and every Jewish experience is represented. The components of this corpus include stories, novels, and poetry. They were written in Yiddish, Hebrew, and English. The literary output of secular Jewish writers is vast. Yiddish literature became its own genre and told stories of the lives of the average and at the time, the everyman, with humor and pathos. Immediately recognizable names are Sholem Aleichem, S. Ansky, and Isaac Bashevis Singer. As well, there are lesser known women Yiddish writers, such as Kadia Molodowski, Anna Margolin, and Celia Dropkin. Devorah Barron wrote first in Yiddish and later in Hebrew about the familiar Yiddish literary theme, the shtetl experience. Her short story, Burying the Books, poignantly described the marginalization of women and their texts from practice and ritual. Jewish poetry presented Jewish life through images, actual and metaphoric, different from the life narratives of characters found in stories and novels. It preserved the past while also editorializing about it. Jewish poets were at times nostalgic, at times indignant, sometimes romantically warmed by heritage, other times angered by it, reacting in protest. Jewish literature included the diasporic experience of immigration and life in America that found early voice in the work of Henry Roth in Call It Sleep, Mary Anton's The Promised Land, and the work of Emma Lazarus, and later in the novels of Philip Roth, Saul Bellow, and Bernard Malamud. Literature reflecting the secular Israeli experience is found in the Hebrew literature of Amos Oz, David Grossman, Ayelet Gunder-Goshen, and Dorit Rabinyan. Of course, there are current notable American Jewish writers such as Michael Chabon, Nicole Krauss, Rebecca Goldstein, and Jonathan Safran Foer. Furthermore, there is a distinct and identifiable category of Jewish literature related thematically to the Holocaust, with many, many examples on contemporary reading lists. In short, if Jews have lived it, modernity has a literary source for it. For secular humanistic Jews, this literature is an expression of Jewish culture. It informs and educates. At the same time, it entertains and celebrates the many aspects of Jewish life. Indeed, Jewish memory is increasingly well preserved in the stories Jews tell about themselves. The other intellectual root, and indeed a passion for me, is Jewish art. Art is distinguished from the written word found in traditional texts, literature, and poetry. The intersection between art and its subcategory of Jewish art is reflected in the words of the sculptor Jacques Lipschitz, who said, "Jewish art? Art is Jewish if a Jew creates it." Marc Chagall said, "If a painter is Jewish and paints life, how can he help having Jewish elements in his work? But if he is a good painter, there will be more than that." The Jewish element will be there, but its art will tend to be universal. Since Jewish culture is made up of the entire output of Jews throughout history, it is evident that every form of material art, therefore, is a part of it. And I think it's important to consider Jewish art in the broadest possible terms and not take a myopic view of what is only inside museums. Jewish art can be political, such as the Zionist propaganda posters of pre-state Israel showing the so-called muscular Jew armed with a spade and or a rifle. It can be additions to the walls and floors of synagogues and other buildings, such as the ancient wall paintings of Dura Europa Synagogue and the floor mosaics of the Sephora Synagogue, or Chagall's stained glass windows at Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. An impressionist painting, an impressionist work depicting a peasant girl by Camille Pissarro, who was born Jewish, identified as an atheist, and did not practice Judaism, would be part of what could be considered then Jewish art. But for my thinking, a work by Rembrandt, who was not Jewish but painted portraits of Jews, would not. Perhaps it's a little gray. The line might not be clear, and you may not agree with where I'm drawing it, but I draw it nonetheless. And there are works that fall in between, but can defensibly be part of Jewish art. Specifically, the illuminated manuscripts of the medieval period found in Haggadot and Sidurim may have been created by Jews or commissioned by them to be created by those who were not Jewish. But they would be considered Jewish art, I think, based on the Jewish personal, familial, and ritual use of these manuscripts. Included also would be the pre-modern realism of Moritz Oppenheim, a religious Jew who sought to depict and preserve Jewish life in the mid-19th century Germany as an example in which both the artist and the subject matter are identifiably Jewish. And more recently, the Medici Archive Project has uncovered the work of a Renaissance Jewish artist, Jonah Osilio, whose still life paintings were very similar to other artists of the time. This find fills a hole in the Renaissance painting thought to be void of Jews. In the 20th century, there are the abstract expressionism of Mark Rothko, the sculpture and assemblages of Louise Nevelson, the cubism of Mario Modigliani, all of which lack a Jewish subject matter, but were created by Jews. Jewish art is more than Judaica, that genre of Jewish ritual object given to decorations. Both Jewish and secular themes shown by Jewish artists are equal parts of Jewish culture. The images Jewish artists created included both Jewish and non-Jewish subjects as their world and worldview expanded. Jewish art became more universalistic and more humanistic. But that's not to say that in the modern era, Jewish art with Jewish subjects was no longer created, because it was. The pop art sculpture of George Segal often has distinctly Jewish themes and allusions, including, for example, a kosher butcher shop and a modern interpretation of the Akedah. Marc Chagall sought to memorialize his childhood in Vitebsk with identifiably Jewish scenes and interpretations of uniquely Jewish expressions. So Jewish art, in all its forms and varieties, in all the eras of Jewish history, comprise an important part of Jewish culture. Jewish art, as well as literature, is a resounding affirmation of the ongoing Jewish experience, and they provide the intellectual ancestors by which I frame my identity as a humanistic Jew.
What do we mean by roots? Well, there are the roots that apply to all Jews and all Judaism. And then there are the roots that apply specifically to our kind of Jews and our kind of Judaism. It's sort of a narrowing down, right? It's sort of the transition from a root to a branch. If we're a leaf on the end, There's the root that applies to the whole Jewish tree, and then there's the branch that's our branch, and then there's the twig. It's sort of like the green grass grew all around. We are one end of that cycle, but we look back and we can find our roots in sources that perhaps our movement wouldn't have celebrated in past generations because we were experiencing the breakaway, the leaving of the religious world and the affirmation of the secular and the humanistic. And so maybe things that were tainted with religious association or with religious sources or with a claim of revelation were beyond the pale of what we would include in our anthology of who we are. And I think what our generation now is doing in our movement is trying to preserve what's valuable of the human experience and the Jewish version of the human experience in these earlier religious sources and not throw it out with the theological bathwater. We want to maintain what's valuable without losing what, while being able to lose what is not as relevant or does not speak to us. So when we think about religious sources like the Torah, the larger Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, even the Talmud itself, we understand this is the founding literature of our culture. These are the origin myths that our people created. These are the rules that our people invented. So even if they said that God said so, we don't have to have an allergy to that. We can say, well, they said God said so, but somebody wrote that God said this. And so we can take the value or the rule and evaluate it and decide, do I agree with this or not? Does this work out well in society? Is it progress for its time, but it needs reframing in modern times? Or is it objectionable from a modern perspective? And I'm willing to affirm that our values today have superseded those values written 2,000, 2,500 years ago. There are certainly insights to be found there. I find wonderful statements in the Mishnah, for example, that compares the person who is slow to anger and slow to calm down versus someone who is quick to anger but quick to calm down, someone who is quick to anger and slow to calm down, and someone who is slow to anger but quick to calm down. And you might see yourself in one or more of those portraits, depending on the day. And you could also see maybe an aspiration to work towards one of those characteristics in your life. Or another one describes how a person should be known. And this is in the male gendered language of the Talmud. And they say he should be known bekoso, bekiso, bekaso, which means in his cups, how he handles his alcohol, in his wallet, how he handles his money, and in his anger, what he does when he's mad. Bekoso, bekiso, bekaso, a wonderful little mnemonic there to remember these three aspects of personality improvement. So again, there are things to be found and celebrate there, but there are also going to be things we disagree with: the treatment of slaves, the treatment of women, the treatment of non-Jews. And as I described at the end of our previous session, we imagine a Venn diagram where there are our values, there are the large set of traditional Jewish values, and then there's the overlap where our values intersect with Jewish values, and we can take pride in the fact that our ancestors came up with this great idea. The idea that you should pay a worker their wages the same day so they're not captive to you. Think about the issues we have today with wage slavery and wage withholding. This was prefigured in Jewish sources 2,500 years ago. I'm proud that my people had that insight, even if they might have made other mistakes. After all, when you admit discontinuity, then your claims of continuity have a lot more credibility to them because you've admitted where you're not connected. We can also find sometimes in those religious sources the people they didn't like or the values they rejected that we actually celebrate. So in one passage in Kings, it says, the fool says, let us eat and drink for tomorrow we die. I thought that'd be a great t-shirt for a movement. Let us eat and drink for tomorrow we die. That's the essence of live this life to its fullest. So we might have a different value. You look at the stories of Elisha ben Avuya, the heretic rabbi, or the character of Lilith in rabbinic midrash, who demands equality for women and is pushed out of the Garden of Eden because of it, and plenty of other examples like that. Now, the second route that we might be willing to draw on that others might not have are other modern versions of Judaism. So certainly we've always drawn on the tradition of secular Jewish movements like the Jewish labor movement, Jewish socialism, aka the Bund, secular labor Zionism, kibbutz Judaism. These have all been, we've seen for many, many decades, consonant and in harmony with our approach to Jewish life as well. And there's also those millions of Jews who may not self-identify as secular, but have secularized their lives and are making their own choices. And we affirm that as a source of our identity. But there were also more religious Jewish movements that took steps in our direction. Think about Reform Judaism, particularly in the 19th century. They transformed the role of the rabbi from a dayan, from a judge, to a pastoral counselor and a communal leader, and the same kind of roles that we fulfill as rabbis today. The Reform movement began the process of editing the prayer book to reflect their beliefs. They were willing to change the text that did not reflect their values, and so too have we. And Reform highlighted the possibility of integrating with the broader culture while maintaining a separate Jewish identity in their own way, and we do the same. We want to have a Jewish future, not just a Jewish present, as they did. We think about reconstructing Judaism and Mordechai Kaplan's concept of Judaism as an evolving civilization, or his wonderfully pithy phrase that tradition has a vote but not a veto, that we can listen to what they say, but we don't have to agree. We are allowed to change our minds. We might go further than Kaplan did, but it's still a step in our direction, so to speak. And most importantly, there are the advocates for Jewish feminism, starting in the 1970s, who were also willing to change liturgy and celebrations. Now, they may have changed their focus from a male god to a female god. So instead of Baruch Atah Adonai, they might say Brucha At Shekhinah, blessed are you, feminine, the divine presence, which is a feminine form of God. So they're still talking to a supernatural being that we might not choose to do, but their willingness to make those changes and to ask those hard questions and to fight for their values is exactly what we try to do. There's a wonderful passage in Judith Plasko's Standing Again at Sinai, where she applies Paul Rickower's concept of the hermeneutic of suspicion, where you ask, who's not included in this conversation? What sources, what voices are not part of this? And we need to transform Judaism by including everybody of all varieties, genders, identities, intermarried Jews as well, and reflect their experience. These are all part of the broad Jewish family, and this is the push that Jewish feminism exemplified. And the last root I want to highlight briefly is the concept of the Jewish historical experience. Where did we live? What languages did we speak? What stories did we tell? What songs did we sing? What foods did we eat? What lessons did we learn from those different times and places? The real experience of the Jewish people is what we share with all Jews, even if some of them don't include all of us in their Jewish orbit of concern. When we learn about the Jewish past, we realize that we draw lessons from that as others might draw different lessons. But our study of Jewish history counts as doing Jewish. It's not just synagogues, it's not just prayer services, it's consuming art, it's reading literature, it's studying how we came to be who we are today. And after all, the Judaism of today will become the Jewish history, the roots of tomorrow.
So I wanted my colleagues to speak first because I knew that they would do a wonderful job of setting the scene and establishing the foundation. As in all things Miriam, I couldn't even connect to this idea until I began to think how it affected me personally. And I see my job in this kind of sunset of my career as being the organizational and the institutional memory of humanistic Judaism. So I begin at the beginning with Rabbi Sherwin Wein. And here's my story. When I was 11 years old, there were a number of young couples in Windsor, Ontario, which is where I lived, who decided that only having an Orthodox synagogue was not a way to raise modern children. So we visited Temple Bethel in Detroit, it was a classical reform congregation. And they had this young rabbi who was looking to be the head of his own congregation, whose name was Sherwin Wein. So from the time that I was 11 through the time I was 15, Sherwin Wein was my rabbi. And those are important years. He was bat mitzvahed me and confirmed me. And then when I graduated from college, I moved to Detroit and we joined the CHJ of Detroit, the Birmingham Temple. So Sherwin was very important in my life. He officiated my brother's funeral. He officiated my grandmother's funeral. He married me both times. And then he named my babies. And he bat mitzvahed them and confirmed them and even married one of them. So let me tell you a little bit about Sherwin. He was born January 25th, 1928. Pay attention to the 1928. It's important. He grew up in a conservative synagogue and studied at the University of Michigan. He studied philosophy. He was all but dissertation in philosophy when he decided that philosophy was exciting and interesting, but he wanted a more hands-on career. So he applied to and was admitted to the Reform Seminary, Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. After about 3 years with the Reform congregation in Windsor, there were a group of young people from Temple Bethel in Detroit who said, we want a suburban congregation. Temple Bethel was still in the city of Detroit, and people had begun to move to the suburbs. Well, little did they know that Sherwin had slightly different ideas of what that might look like. And it took him about 9 months after the congregation was founded before he started to introduce humanistic liturgy and remove some of the more traditional prayers. He had a ritual committee because he wanted buy-in. It's very interesting. And then shortly after he organized the Birmingham Temple, he became a topic in Time magazine, not the cover of Time magazine, that's a myth, but it did say atheist rabbi. So we began to get all kinds of requests from all over the country. And in 1969, he founded the Society for Humanistic Judaism. Now, the word founded is very important in the history of Sherwin-T-Y. And I will talk a little bit about some of the different things he founded that made his reach so important. In 2003, the American Humanist Association named him the Humanist of the Year. You only had to sit in one of the discussions where a young man stood up and said, "What's happening to the American Humanist Association? We're giving this award to a rabbi." Very interesting. So I just wanted to share one of the learnings that I have from Sherwin, the one that's the most important to me. And it's about who we are. How do you determine what a person is? How do we know what their message really is? So he spoke about honesty. He said, honesty begins with behavior. What we really think and feel is reflected in what we do. Too often we imagine that we know what we want and believe. We check our conscious mind and encounter numerous ideas and convictions which claim to be the essence of our being, but they are obvious frauds. Our tongue speaks love, but our hands speak hate. Our mouth exudes serenity, but our eyes exude fear. Our lips utter friendship, but our whole body screams anger. We feel sincere, and so we imagine that we are sincere. We feel honest, and so we imagine that we are honest. If we listen to our hearts, we shall never discover the truth. It is only when we coldly watch our own behavior that we confront reality. Our deepest convictions about ourselves and others can never really be hidden. They boldly proclaim themselves through our actions. While our mouths spin tales of fantasy, our bodies speak with honesty. When we plead that we cannot act on our beliefs, we are self-deceived. We always act on what we believe. When we run away from what we say we love, then our love is an illusion. And when we passionately embrace what we say we hate, then our hatred is unreal. We simply are what we do. From the awareness of this truth, all self-insight proceeds. So Sherwin taught me many things. He taught me about integrity. He taught me that love is love, no matter where it is or however it is expressed. But this teaching of we are our behavior is what has stayed with me. The next person I want to talk a little bit about is Howard Radist. Now, Adam mentioned that Felix Adler founded Ethical Culture, or you didn't, but I thought you did because you talked about Kaplan. So I will say that Felix Adler, who was the son of a Reform rabbi, founded Ethical Culture, and Howard Radist, who was born in Brooklyn in 1928 and was born Jewish, became very involved in ethical culture. He received his BA from Columbia and a master's from the New School, but he also then became the executive director of the American Ethical Union. He returned to school and received a PhD in philosophy from Columbia, and he went on to teach philosophy at a New Jersey college for 12 years. But we all met first in 1980 at an organizational meeting of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, the American Humanist Association, Unitarian Universalists, Ethical Culture, and other independent humanists. We met at the University of Chicago. And at that meeting, they founded the North American Committee for Humanism and the Humanist Institute. The Humanist Institute was a leadership training program for humanist leaders. So I became a member of that first class, and Howard Radist was our guide. He was exciting to study with. I think maybe I got part of my teaching style, which is Socratic, from him because it was how he taught. In 1984, we invited him to the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and the conference was about ethics, and he spoke on social ethics. And he talked about 3 axioms, and I'll read them quickly. The underlying notion underneath his 3 axioms was we have a future. So the first axiom was humanists are optimists. Now, to be an optimist does not mean to be engaged in wishful thinking. We fail often enough, and it would be nonsense to deny it. By optimism, then, I mean a certain stance toward history, which allows us to think sensibly of hope, effort, and the possibility of the better. The second axiom is humanists are activists. To be active is to persevere, or to be active is to preserve or change what we find in the world. The corollary brings the point into relief. Human intentions, purposes, and ends are realistic. And the third axiom, our humanists are moralists. Purposes, values, and choices describe the experience and participation in the natural order, permitting distinctions between better and worse. This axiom may be restated as moral values can be discovered. Now, Howard and Sherwin became very good friends because they both had the same vision, and that was that institutions will help preserve what you were passionate about in terms of your beliefs, especially if they were new beliefs, and they were wonderful partners. Well, after he finished with the humanists, he started making connections with secular Jews in Israel. And the first connection that I remember was with Shulamit Aloni, who was also born in 1928. Aloni was an Israeli politician. When she came to the Society for Humanistic Judaism, I was asked to introduce her. It was really the launching of my personal leadership. And after I finished introducing her, she said, "Thank you, Miriam, now I can die." So I figured, I might be good at this funeral thing too. Aloni was born in Poland, but she grew up in Tel Aviv from an early age. She was a teacher. She became a lawyer. She founded her own party. She was a member of parliament in the Knesset, and she also won the Israel Prize. Aloni told me something on the side, and I did some research and could not find it written anywhere, but she was present at the Oslo Accords in 1993. And one of the things that I've been thinking about since the Russians invaded Ukraine is something that she said to me after she returned from Oslo. She said, you know, people are criticizing me, those who knew that I was there, because they said you don't negotiate with your enemies. And she said, you know, you don't negotiate with your friends. If you want peace, you negotiate with your enemies. And I just want to read a short section of something that she said in a visionary piece about what Zionism should really be and the state of Israel. The state of Israel will be open to Jewish immigration and to the ingathering of the exiles. It will be devoted to the development of the land to the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on the foundations of freedom, justice, and peace in the light of the vision of the prophets of Israel. It will maintain absolute social and political equality of all its citizens without difference of religion, race, and sex. It will ensure freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will preserve the sacred places of all religions and be faithful to the principles of the United Nations Covenant. If only it were true. So I couldn't talk about modern Israelis without talking about Yehuda America. I first met Amichai when he came to the 14th annual meeting of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, which was held in Cambridge. I spent an afternoon with him walking around Harvard's campus. And honestly, he spoke in poetry. We walked into an elevator and he said, like two tightly wound Torah scrolls entering the ark. I looked at him and I said, what are you doing? But he was so down to earth. He was so human. And because I had these connections with both Aloni and Amichai, whenever anybody from the university, whenever they invited either one of them from the University of Michigan, I was always their guide. And when Aloni came, we went clothes shopping. You know, so, you know, you know these people and they're so revered and rightly so, yet they were so human and so inspiring. Amichai is considered one of the greatest Israeli poets ever. He won many prizes, the Shalansky Prize, the Brenner Prize, the Bialik Prize, and also the Israel Prize. One of the most interesting things about him is that in 1994, Yitzhak Rabin invited him to read his poems at the Nobel Prize meeting in Stockholm at his ceremony, at Rabin's ceremony. So I wanted to read just a little bit of Amichai's poem about the Jews, because he had such a skill at taking modern culture and tradition and bringing them together in life in words that even I can understand, because poetry was not my thing until I read Yehuda Amichai. So this poem starts like this. The Jews are like photos in a display window, all of them together, short and tall, alive and dead, brides and grooms, bar mitzvah boys and babies. Some are restored from old yellowed photographs. Sometimes people come and break the window and burn the pictures. And then they start photographing and developing all over again and displaying them again, sad and smiling. And about God, God lingered like the scent of a beautiful woman who once faced them in passing, and they didn't see her face. Only her fragrance remained, kinds of perfumes. Blessed be the creator of kinds of perfumes. A Jewish man, remember, see, I didn't cry when I introduced Mary, but I cry when I read this. It's so much about who we are. A Jewish man remembers the sukkah in his grandfather's home. And the sukkah remembers for him the wandering in the desert that remembers the grace of youth and the tablets of the 10 Commandments and the gold of the golden calf and the thirst and the hunger that remember Egypt. The Jews are buffeted by suffering and polished by torments like pebbles on the seashore. The Jews are distinguished only in their death as pebbles among other stones. When the mighty hand flings them, they skip 2 times or 3 on the surface of the water before they drown. Some time ago, I met a beautiful woman whose grandfather performed circumcision. Long before she was born, I told her, "You don't know me, and I don't know you, but we are the Jewish people. Your dead grandfather, and I the circumcised, and you the beautiful granddaughter with golden hair. We are the Jewish people." And what about God? Once we sang, "There is no God like ours." Now we sing, "There is no God of ours." But we sing, we still sing.
Thank you, Miriam and Jody. This was an exploration of our roots. But one of the things that differentiates our movements from some other movements in Jewish life is the question of authority, and who gives authority, who takes authority, and who deserves authority. It's ironic, we were founded by a Reform rabbi in the Chicago area. Rabbi Daniel Friedman was the lead rabbi of the humanistic congregation in the metro area for a long time. But things have changed over time, and we understand how authority works differently, and we reevaluate our roots. We have an anthology that our movement published in 1995. I hate to tell you that was 27 years ago, and I remember it well too. And it was a collection at the time of 50 thinkers that we thought articulated who we are and what defines our movement. They drew on that world of secular Judaism, of Yiddish literature, of Zionist ideology, of the Bund and Jewish socialism, and of the founders of our movement. 27 years on, looking back at that anthology, we still find much of value, and yet we also might reevaluate those choices. And this past year, I had the opportunity to work with 2 of my colleagues, with Rabbi Jody and with Rabbi Jeremy Kreidel of Mahar Congregation in DC, to envision what a new anthology might be like. In fact, this panel discussion came out of those conversations about what would we choose to include in an anthology in 2022, differently from 1995. And we might ask different questions as well. We might ask, these are wonderful ideals, but how did it play out in reality? In fact, the passage, Miriam, that you read, you attributed to Aloni, I think it's from the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. It's her quoting it and saying, this is what we want. In fact, I know people who will read from that at an Israeli Independence Day celebration, and it's actually in Hebrew called the Megillat HaAtzmaut. It's the scroll of independence. And so it's like a Megillah reading, not for Purim, but for a different holiday, and to look at those ideals and what can we do to meet those. But just as in America, we look at the ideals of all men are created equal, and we ask, how well was that enacted, and where are the holes and what needs to change in those ideals? And we're also allowed to disagree. I grew up with Sherwin as my rabbi too. The idea of disagreeing with him felt foreign. That was not something we experienced. But I don't want my congregants, I don't want our rabbinic students to have that approach. I want them to be able to disagree with our founding figures, because that's not how authority works in a humanistic setting. Your authority comes from what you know and from the force of your argument and from the evidence you bring to support your conclusion. It doesn't come from who you are or where you went to school. So our approach to roots, I think, is different because our balance of the present and the past is different. The past had its authority and had its value, and then we get to reevaluate it in our own days. And that applies from now looking back to 1995, or from the 21st century looking back to the 20th century, or going back in many centuries before that. I find that liberating. I find that exciting. It opens up all kinds of new possibilities in art and literature, in poetry, and in the creative community work that all of our congregations are doing. So I found this topic to be a really exciting and interesting one. I know our panelists did as well. I'm curious if you had any reactions to any of the other comments that were made. And again, if there are comments or questions, either for those in person to come up to the mic and offer those, or for those online to this time type in the chat box, because I switched to my phone, I can't see the Q&A. So we opened the chat, and on the Zoom webinar, if you type in the chat, I'll be able to see your questions and work them into the conversation. If anyone here has a comment or question, please step to the mic and offer it. Jody, did you have any thoughts you wanted to add?
So one of the fascinating things about such esteemed colleagues is, in fact, the different viewpoints that we bring. We get together annually, pre-pandemic, through our Association of Humanistic Rabbis. And I always refer to those meetings as getting a booster shot. Now, again, it was pre-pandemic. So that really took on a very different meaning. But, I'm fortunate that Miriam is not only my friend and my guide, but I consider her my rabbi, that Adam is here locally as a resource, and that I have colleagues throughout North America. And yet each of us, I think, approaches things from the same base level, the same basic understanding, but we branch out in different ways. We bring our personalities to what we do. We bring our own experiences to what we do. And as you could hear by our presentations, we bring our own understanding of what helps shape us as humanistic Jews and humanistic rabbis. When Adam's speaking about authorities, I always sort of viewed this as instead of a vertical hierarchy, a horizontal hierarchy, which might sound like a contradiction in terms, but instead, it's meant to say that it's more open, it's wider, it gives other people voices, and I think that that's one of the beauties of what we have, and one of the things going forward that we can continue to incorporate in the work that we do, in the thinking that we do, in the writing that we do, and in the ceremonial work that we do.
So if I had only thought humanistic rabbis could be like Rabbi Sherwin-Wine, I never would have become a rabbi. And one of the things that is most important to me when I teach rabbinic students is to help them find their own voice. Because each one of us, and each one of you, by the way, have your own voice. And that's what I find exciting about the whole issue of authority. I see it always as an interplay with other rabbis and colleagues, but with every person I come into contact with. It was a long time ago when I walked into the congregation in North Carolina, and every time you went to call somebody, their name was Dr. somebody or other. This was like a very intimidating group of people, but a very intelligent group of people, which is always exhilarating. I learn as much as I teach. Anybody?
So if we have any comments or questions, I mean, this is sort of undermining our claim about authority, because nobody wants to challenge or ask any questions. I mean, I will say there is something liberating that Sherwin did do in his approach, even to traditional sources. And that was that he decided he no longer needed to kosherize everything. And what Sherwin meant by kosherizing was, let me find a quote from the Torah that doesn't exactly say what I wanted to say, but I'm going to make it say what I wanted to say. He also used the phrase mental gymnastics to try to, contort things into the right position. The fact that you don't always need to find an old source to say what's true and to say what's moral and to say what's important to be said. You can find echoes of that, prefigurations of those at times, but that doesn't define the set of your values. After all, there are values that are part of the modern world that are not reflected in Torah and Talmud literature, and we don't have to reject those to still claim some kind of Jewish values. In fact, our next section will be talking about this balance of inheritance and authenticity, and how do we find the right approach to connecting to our past without being subservient to the authority of the past, where we get to make our choices. In fact, the model of inheritance is one that we'll be speaking about in our next session. Well, there is a chat on the in the Zoom. Thank you. One question was Sherwin's, quote, mental gymnastics a response to Kaplan and Reconstructionism? I think in part because Mordecai Kaplan's approach was he prioritized the continuity of saying the old words as much as possible. He did make changes for sure, but he still maintained a personal God language, for example, that he did not believe in intellectually. But he wanted to maintain that continuity at the expense of the integrity of saying clearly what you believe, where Sherwin was more willing to make those changes. I think it was more Sherwin's response to his Reform rabbinic experience in the 1950s, going to HUC and then working in Reform temples, where the feeling was they wanted to hold up the Torah as a symbol of their Judaism and all that was right and good in the world, and yet the content of it didn't reflect that lifestyle and that belief system. And so he felt constrained to have to read the Torah portion every single week, exactly as prescribed, and like it or not, you had to make something good out of what he didn't necessarily agree with. Now, I hope, as you saw from our first session, you can actually find interesting material in a section that otherwise might seem to be legalistic and foreign and not relevant. Nevertheless, he felt like the idea of kosherizing by getting a proof text that could justify what you already believe to be true, you didn't need to do that. And in fact, sometimes the modern sources that articulate that, like Amichai's poetry, even as it draws on the older sources, still says it better. And we can use that version too. We have a question here in the room.
I just wanted to add to this concept, the way that I remember that is a quote of Sherwin's talking about the mental gymnastic, and says, if you need to, just say, according to Rabbi Woo from Ha Ha.
There's also the story that Sherwin at a funeral once said, as an ancient rabbi wrote, Shimu, Shimu, he quoted himself. And Miriam, it was a wedding, and then Miriam said, what are you talking about, ancient rabbi? He said, I'm ancient.
One thing I did not hear y'all mention was the role of Jewish journalism in the development of and continuation of secular Judaism, and it's an issue that's obviously a concern for me with the magazine, but also it's concerned looking at the state of Jewish journalism all across the spectrum, including like when the Forward cut their print publication altogether; they're only online only. And it worries me because I feel like journalism and this not just being a one-way communication, but two-way, readers back to the magazines and publications, has been a big part of developing secular Jewish identity. I know some people have said, well, it's okay, the internet's going to replace that. On the other hand, to me, it feels like that the internet is all about short little snippets, not so much the thoughtful kind of things that can happen in journalistic endeavors. And so I'm curious if y'all have any thoughts on that, particularly as far as it may not look the same it is in the past, but what could this media do, to further a movement?
So my thoughts on Jewish journalism is that, to draw on an old line, Jews are like everybody else, only more so. So the phenomenon that's hitting general journalism is hitting Jewish journalism too. And if the Forward was the preeminent daily document for secular Jews 100 years ago, there is no equivalent today, but we live in a different world, and print media is very different, and print newspapers are different. When you use I sometimes make a mistake and use the phrase the phone book when I'm talking to Sunday school students, and they have no idea what I'm talking about. So this is just the evolution of generations. And I don't know that it will be bad or worse. I think it will be different. And after all, the decentralization of knowledge with the internet enables new sources and new writers to come forward that aren't being gatekept by the print journalist enterprises. I mean, self-publishing is a blessing and a curse in its own way to get your words out there, but then you got to flog it every day. So I think that it's going to be different. I'm not sure it's going to be better or worse. It has its own challenges, as the old model did too. So one more question here, and then any last thoughts from us as we wrap up.
You mentioned in 1995, you did the list of the 50 influential people. Where can we find that?
The book is for sale in the lobby. And we'll be happy to handle that after at the end of our last session.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you for teeing that question up for Adam.
I didn't pay it. Any last closing thoughts?
So once again, I think, we were sort of given our, I don't really want to use the phrase marching orders, but our assignments as far as what we were going to do. And it was only a couple of days ago that we shared a text as in on your phone, that we, you got to remember what words you're using and where you are, that we shared a text that kind of expanded on what we each in a very general way intended to say. I think that a variety of positions has been very well represented. And it certainly has been my privilege to be up here with my colleagues.
Me too. Ditto.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to Rabbis Jody and Miriam.